This is Jakarta, the sprawling capital of Indonesia, has become one of Southeast Asia's most successful incubators of new technology companies, raising hopes that the country's difficult geography, a vast archipelago spread across thousands of islands, can finally be overcome through digitization. Today, it is one of the largest and most congested urban regions on Earth. Its streets are packed with motorcycles. Its malls are overflowing with shoppers. And its skyline is rising faster than almost anywhere else in the developing world. Indonesia's economy is booming. Foreign investment is pouring into the country. Massive nickel exports have turned Indonesia into the center of the global EV battery supply chain. Chinese companies are spending billions of dollars building giant industrial parks and factories across the archipelago. President Prabowo believes this growth can transform Indonesia into a rich country within the next 2 decades. And on paper, at least, the numbers look incredible. Indonesia is now one of the fastest growing major economies in the world. Its economy expanded by more than 5% last year, outperforming much of Europe, East Asia, and Latin America. But beneath the headline growth figures lies a much more fragile reality. Because while Indonesia's economy is growing rapidly, millions of Indonesians are no longer feeling richer. The middle class is shrinking. Real wages have barely moved in years. Layoffs are surging across manufacturing industries, and the government is taking increasingly risky economic bets to keep growth alive. At the same time, the country's industrial rise has become deeply dependent on Chinese money, Chinese technology, and Chinese demand, a dependency that is now colliding with rising geopolitical tensions between Beijing and Washington. Investors are getting nervous. The Jakarta stock market is already one of the worst performers in Asia this year. The currency is weakening, and fears are growing that Indonesia may be drifting toward the same kind of populist economic model that has destabilized other resource-rich economies in the past. Because Indonesia's problem is not that the boom is fake. The boom is very real. The problem is that the very forces driving Indonesia's rise may also be creating the conditions for its future instability. So, is Indonesia becoming the next great Asian economic powerhouse? Or is the country building its growth on increasingly fragile foundations? For most of the 20th century, Indonesia was seen as a resource-rich but chronically underdeveloped economy. A vast archipelago of more than 17,000 islands, rich in oil, nickel, and natural gas, yet constantly struggling with corruption, weak infrastructure, and financial instability. Indonesians are used to near anonymity on the world stage. The last time the country's economy and politics truly captured global attention was during the chaos of the late 1990s, when the Asian financial crisis tore through the region. Indonesia's crony capitalist system collapsed almost overnight. The currency imploded. Riots erupted across Jakarta, and the crisis ultimately brought down the 32-year dictatorship of President Suharto. But over the past 20 years, Indonesia has quietly transformed itself into one of the most important emerging economies in the world. Between the 1980s and mid-1990s, Indonesia experienced rapid economic expansion driven by oil revenues, manufacturing growth, and market reforms. Then came President Jokowi. Under his administration, the government aggressively focused on infrastructure construction, foreign investment, and a policy known as downstreaming, the idea that Indonesia should stop exporting raw materials and instead process them domestically. The economy settled into something surprisingly rare for a large developing country: stable growth of around 5% almost every single year. Today, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim-majority country, the third largest democracy, and the fourth most populous nation on Earth, home to more than 276 million people spread across thousands of islands. Unlike export-driven economies such as South Korea or Taiwan, Indonesia's economy is powered primarily by domestic consumption. Its consumer market is enormous. Its workforce is young. And a rapidly expanding digital economy is integrating the archipelago into a single market, with more than 100 million people spending tens of billions of dollars each year on everything from e-payments and ride-hailing apps to online commerce and on-demand logistics services. But Southeast Asia's largest economy is becoming increasingly important for another reason. Indonesia sits on more than a fifth of the world's nickel reserves, a metal that has become critically important for electric vehicle batteries. And unlike many developing economies that simply export raw commodities abroad, Indonesia wanted to force more of the supply chain to stay inside the country itself. In 2020, the government banned the export of raw nickel ore entirely. Companies that wanted access to Indonesia's nickel would now have to process and refine it domestically. It was an aggressive strategy, but it worked. Billions of dollars in foreign investment flooded into the country almost overnight. Giant industrial parks emerged across remote islands. Today, Indonesia produces more nickel than the rest of the world combined. Chinese companies, in particular, have invested heavily into this industrial expansion, building vertically integrated supply chains stretching from mining and refining all the way to EV battery production. And for a while, the strategy appeared to be a spectacular success. Economic growth remained strong. Infrastructure rapidly expanded. Foreign investment surged. And Indonesia suddenly looked like it might finally escape the so-called middle-income trap that has stalled so many developing economies. Part of Indonesia's appeal was that it appeared to have found something relatively rare in the developing world, a way to combine democracy with long-term economic reform, reflecting the traumas of the 1990s. A flawed but relatively pluralistic political system emerged that emphasized compromise and social stability. Corruption remained a serious problem, but the economy gradually became more open. But this boom also masked a growing weakness, because while the country was getting richer on paper, many Indonesians were quietly falling behind. Over the past 5 years, millions of Indonesians have quietly fallen out of the middle class. The number of people classified as middle income declined from more than 57 million to below 48 million. And the problem is not that Indonesians have stopped working. Indonesia continues to create millions of jobs every year. The issue is the kind of jobs being created. A growing share of the workforce is trapped in low-paying, low-productivity, and often informal employment. Street vendors, delivery drivers, temporary contract workers, gig economy jobs with little long-term security. Meanwhile, many of the industries that traditionally created stable middle-class employment are struggling. Factories are laying off workers as they face rising competition from cheaper producers, automation, and slowing global demand. Some companies are even relocating production elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And for workers who remain employed, wages have barely kept up with inflation. Real wages, meaning wages adjusted for rising prices, have effectively stagnated for years, which means many Indonesians are technically earning more money than before, while being able to afford less with it. Sales of motorcycles and cars remain below pre-pandemic trends. Consumer debt problems are rising, and many households are becoming increasingly dependent on government subsidies and social assistance just to maintain their standard of living. This creates a serious long-term problem, because countries do not become rich simply by extracting natural resources or building smelters. They become rich by creating large, productive, high-income middle classes, capable of driving consumption, investment, innovation, and tax revenues. But Indonesia's current growth model is producing a much more uneven outcome. A small number of sectors tied to commodities and downstream processing are booming, while large parts of the broader population are seeing far fewer benefits. And this is where Indonesia's economic story starts becoming much more complicated, because the country's industrial rise is not just dependent on nickel, it is dependent on China. Over the past decade, Chinese companies, backed by state banks, industrial policy, and enormous amounts of capital, have spread aggressively across the developing world in search of the resources needed for the green energy transition. Lithium in South America, cobalt in Central Africa, copper in Peru, and nickel in Indonesia. Chinese firms invested billions of dollars into giant industrial parks across remote parts of the archipelago, most notably in places like Morowali and Weda Bay. These were not just ordinary factories. They were vertically integrated industrial ecosystems designed to control every stage of production, from mining and refining all the way to battery-grade chemical processing. Today, Chinese companies control the overwhelming majority of Indonesia's nickel refining capacity. This created an unusual relationship between the two countries. At first, this looked like a perfect partnership. Indonesia received investment, infrastructure, jobs, and export growth. China secured a stable supply of critical minerals for its rapidly expanding EV industry. Everybody appeared to win, but this model also created new vulnerabilities. For one thing, much of the value generated by the nickel boom is still being captured by foreign firms rather than ordinary Indonesians. While industrial output surged, many higher-paying technical and managerial positions remained dominated by Chinese expertise and capital networks. For years, Indonesia's economic strategy benefited from a relatively stable global environment. But under President Prabowo Subianto, the country began taking a far more aggressive economic approach. He wanted Indonesia to achieve 8% annual economic growth. He wanted to accelerate industrialization, build massive infrastructure projects, expand welfare programs, and turn Indonesia into a high-income country by 2045. At the center of this vision was one enormously expensive promise: free meals. Prabowo's flagship program aims to provide free daily meals and milk to tens of millions of school children and pregnant women across the country. Supporters argue that it could improve nutrition, education outcomes, and long-term human capital development. The program is expected to consume tens of billions of dollars annually, making it one of the largest welfare initiatives in Indonesian history. And it arrived at almost the worst possible time. Because just as government spending was exploding, global energy prices started rising again. Indonesia may be rich in natural resources, but it is also heavily dependent on imported oil. To maintain social stability, the government subsidizes fuel prices, keeping gasoline artificially cheap for consumers. As global geopolitical tensions intensified and energy markets became more volatile, Indonesia suddenly found itself squeezed between two extremely expensive political priorities: maintaining fuel subsidies and funding Prabowo's massive welfare ambitions. And the weakening rupiah became such a concern. A weaker currency makes imports more expensive. It raises the cost of servicing foreign debt. And for Indonesia specifically, it makes fuel subsidies even more expensive because oil is largely priced in US dollars. So does all of this mean Indonesia is heading towards some kind of inevitable crisis? Not necessarily. In fact, compared to many developing economies, Indonesia still has enormous advantages. But Indonesia is now entering a far more difficult phase of development. It is relatively easy for developing economies to grow by exporting commodities, building roads, and shifting workers from farms into factories. It is much harder to transition into a genuinely high-income economy, driven by productivity, innovation, advanced manufacturing, and high-skilled labor. This is the stage where many countries get stuck. Economists often call it the middle-income trap. The success of an economy is not measured by how many smelters it builds or how fast its stock market rises during a boom. It is measured by whether ordinary people actually feel their lives improving over time. And that is the question Indonesia still hasn't fully answered. Will the country successfully transform itself into the next great Asian economic powerhouse? Or will the very forces driving its rise slowly turn into the source of its future instability? Only time will tell.